But part of the problem that we sort of inevitably ended up spending a lot of our conversation over the hour and a half we were talking had to do with the subject of this next panel, which is the role of information and mis and disinformation in the healthcare ecosystem. So I want to bring up the panelists. Why don't you guys come on up, welcome the first discussion of the morning, which is misinformation finding signal in the noise. And let me do some quick introductions before we get started. Sitting immediately to my right is Lynn Hanessian, who is the Chief Strategist Health for Edelman. And Edelman is a global communications company that I've worked with my entire career. And there's just so many smart and interesting people there, and they do really interesting work in policy and in communications. Lynn has a very deep background in health, medical science, strategic positioning, works across the healthcare ecosystem. She serves as a board member for the Center for Healthcare Innovation and the Asthma and Allergy Foundation, and has held positions at the American Academy of Pediatrics, the Cancer Prevention Fund, and the University of Chicago. Next to Lynn is Gul Dolan, MD, PhD, from Brown and MIT. It was where she did her work. She completed postdoctoral training in psychiatry at Stanford and is now the professor and endowed chair at UC Berkeley. Go Bears. I'm a double graduate of Berkeley, so there's been a lot of Stanford here over the last 2 days. I'm really happy to see some Golden Bears, although our football team is always terrible. Her laboratory has discovered a novel mechanism that could account for a broad range of therapeutic applications for which psychedelics are being tested. James Madera is the CEO of the American Medical Association. His career began at Harvard with clinical and research training, and he was a tenured professor of pathology and a director of the NIH-sponsored Harvard Digestive Disease Center. After 5 years, he served as the Thompson Distinguished Service Professor and Dean of the University of Chicago Pritzker School of Medicine, CEO of the University of Chicago Hospitals, along with his current position as CEO of the AMA. He's also chairman of Health 2047, the wholly owned innovation subsidiary of the AMA, created to overcome systemic dysfunction in the U.S. health. Good luck with that. So let's get started. Where are my notes? My goodness. Oh, here we go. I want to start with a question for you, Lynn. One of the things that, how many of you have heard of the Trust Barometer, the Edelman Trust Barometer? If you haven't, look into it. Edelman sort of made a brand in not just understanding trust, but sort of defining it and helping people understand what's trusted, what's not trusted. And I think trust is sort of at the core of what we're talking about when it comes to understanding the information ecosystem. So what can you tell us about the state of trust in medicine and healthcare right now?
Well, so it's been a great couple of days here. And I am delighted that folks like Jordan set me up beautifully. Let's remember yesterday morning's beautiful, clear to see graph of our health system here in the United States.
From Jordan's presentation, yeah.
Spectacular. And let's also talk about that barrier of getting people to health, okay? So I'm going to use, again, inspired by JJ's presentation, a little micro bubble to put into your brains about what the state of trust is and what is at stake. Because we've heard a lot of terrific innovations. What if those innovations don't have a market, right? We can prove a lot of science, but right now we're at this incredible friction point where people do not trust these pillars of society. Our trust in business, in not-for-profits, in media, in government and health, at the bottom. We don't trust any of them. We as individuals now have made a very internal personal decision to trust just ourselves and our doctors and people like me. And in the last year, trust in the United States in healthcare companies fell by 11 points into deeply distrusted. And so what we have, and we also took a look at innovation, people are also very fearful of innovation. Where are we leaders in the US? We're leaders at tech innovation. Where are we also leaders? We are leaders in the belief that tech is going to harm our health. Consumers are worried about innovation. They're concerned about the mismanagement of innovation. And they're deeply worried that technology and innovation brought to healthcare is going to harm my health, is going to invade my privacy, is going to create information I don't want to hear and know. So we've got some problems to solve. And we also know, because we asked very specifically in a number of different use cases, how willing are you to accept a new innovation in health? And if you don't trust, if you don't have confidence, you are more likely to reject it. And what does rejection mean? Rejection means I'm not going to buy it. I'm not going to influence my legislators. I'm not going to champion it. I'm going to cut off my nose to spite my face and reject something that might protect me and my family. Now, there is some hope here, because I don't want to just be a complete buzzkill after last night. Not my plan.
Are you saying there was some buzz last night?
I was inspired by gummies. I'm just going to say, with vitamins in the middle.
Right.
Because that is fundamental here. If we want to help to move these innovations forward, we're going to have to move our citizens and our publics along with us. And we have some great inspiration and storytelling to help people imagine. And they need to not only imagine something statically, they need to understand it in relation to their lives. Conveniently, they're getting their information from a number of different sources. But everyone in the room has a responsibility to help build that trust, because when we see trust built, if we find the opportunity to build trust, and we define it in the healthcare ecosystem. We don't ask them to say, do you trust health system? Do you trust the pharmaceutical company? We say, the ecosystem. We all have a role here. When we have increase in trust in the ecosystem and patient empowerment, people are more likely to do the things like see their doctor, follow the doctor's recommendations, get their vaccines, and have better hygiene around their health information. So we have a real difficult position that we're in now, that even though this country is the epicenter of innovation, and we spend the most on health, we are the least trusting, we're the most worried, we are concerned about the politicization of medical science, more so than another pandemic. And there are three things that when we ask our consumers, what's the thing that three things that prevent you from taking care of your health as the best you can? One is affordability. Number two is information. Where do I get trusted information? And number three is access. And we have shown in our research that every stakeholder in the system, if they become a reliable source of information, their trust will rise. And what consumers want is information that is relevant to them and builds their understanding about what to do for themselves and their loved ones.
Wow. So this leads very well to what I want to ask James about. And then when we get to you, Gol, we're going to get to a specific example. But let me pick up on that word, because we've done this. We managed to have no politics for the last 2 days, but you just said the word, so I'm going to then sort of pick at it a little bit, because when you and I spoke prior to this event, you told me a couple stories about how speech and words have become politicized. And as a doctor and in your position, you found it increasingly difficult to have conversations because of the presumptions of political intent behind what you need to talk about. So can you tell me, how is it that science became politicized? And can you give me an example of how that's happened in your work?
Yeah, so what I would say is that we failed to give context to the observations that we were making about the pandemic, for example. And in thinking of the context, by what I mean by that is the context of certainty. And you can think of certainty on an axis, and one end is truth that's objective, underlying facts. The demonstration of the politicization is that in DC in the last couple of years, I've heard people use the phrase true facts, in which case which one of those words doesn't stand on its own. But we go from, that extreme end of truth and facts that starts probably with physical sciences, the formula for the area of a circle or the volume of a sphere. And then just, to the right of that a little bit are things that underlie, that incorporate human observation, that are facts. It's a fact that there was a man that's put a foot on the moon in 1969. There's a fact that the first generation of vaccines for the original virus of COVID-19 were highly efficacious, particularly in preventing severe disease and whatnot. And we go a little further to the right, and we get into more of a subjective area. General AI is going to do something scary. General AI, you don't have to worry about. General AI, the risk is very small. Who knows? And then you get to the far end where it's just completely subjective. I love the Doc logo. The gray hats are better than the white hats. Who can?
Well, you're right about that.
Yeah. And so we have to give some context. So, otherwise people hear, you don't need masks. Oh, by the way, you do need masks. The history of vaccine development is it takes, 4 to 6 years to develop. Oh, by the way, we developed in 11 months, and we're calling it warp speed. Sounds sloppy, but we didn't give the context of certainty of any of this. We never, said in the beginning, this is a novel virus. We don't know very much. We've only had a couple months experience, but based on what we know, we would think that this is the best way of looking at it. And we were missing that certainty context to it. And one of the things I've learned is that in having these conversations, it's really important to listen to other points of view, and rather than trying to contradict them, try to tease out, where this is coming from. So I had a conversation with someone that was, stating as fact something that was on the really far end of the certainty spectrum. And it turned out where this fact came from was he had read the story in The Onion. And
Now, did he cite The Onion as the authoritative source?
We finally got to The Onion when we, asked the questions, and then it was just a matter of conversation. Do you read the New York Post? He did, not surprisingly. The Economist, it's shockingly yes. Where do you think this lies between The Economist and the New York Post? What do you think about that? And this goes to a cognitive bias. It's called the Dunning-Kruger effect. Where a little bit of information makes everyone feel like they're an expert in a particular area. And Dunning and Kruger were psychologists at Cornell, and the original observation that stimulated this work was actually kind of interesting, which was a person outside of Pittsburgh robbed 2 banks in the middle of the day with no mask on, completely apparent face, and he was arrested that same day. And he was surprised that he was arrested because he said, I was surprised because of the juice. And he was asked, well, what do you mean the juice? And he had read that if you put lemon juice on your face, you disappear and you can't be visualized in film. He was asked about that, and he actually, part of the story was he proved it to himself by taking a photograph of himself and not being able to see his face. The problem was he had the camera turned the wrong way. But this we see a lot. Everyone was in 2020 was an expert in science. Not only an expert in science, they were professional virologists. When you listen to them, so it was really important that we think about this cognitive bias that we all have. Confirmation bias, self-affirming bias. And as we're talking with someone else, we have to think about our own biases as well. So I think that we need to approach these conversations with some humility. What I've just outlined maybe doesn't scale, but if it's a sociologically accepted behavior, that we can adopt, it has a substantial impact. And the last thing I'll say is I was involved in a conversation at the National Academies for what we do about science misinformation. And the thrust of the conversation was, put out a standard National Academy white paper in this area, which was, the problem is people don't trust the elites. So the National Academy is going to put something out that says, and we at the National Academy studied this problem, isolated the germane effects, then feed into it and came up with these 12 points. I mean, that's ridiculous. I think it has to be handled in a very different, more humane.
So the elites said, really, you should trust the elites.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. So we have to think about our conversations, I think, in a very different kind of way, anchor them to a certainty axis, and be sure that we convey that before we speak and give recommendations in areas like this.
And as I understand it, and this relates to what I'm about to ask you, Gol, is what happened during the pandemic was that the authorities that were helping the public understand what was happening sort of changed course a number of times.
That's right.
And that became like, wait, I'm supposed to wear a mask. No, I'm not supposed to wear a mask. I need to be 6 feet away from people. Wait, no, it's okay. And so on and so forth. And it shifted, that information changed because we were dealing with a fast moving set of facts, right?
That's right.
And then the conflict in sets of facts became political fodder.
That's right.
To prove that the experts were not worth trusting. Is that
That's exactly right. And we gave no idea where we were in the certainty axis when we gave this information. No mask, vaccines.
And so if instead the public officials responsible for delivering the information at the moment that they could do their best needed to wrap that in a sort of cognitive layer of, look, this is the best information we have right now. It may change because we're doing science here.
Exactly right. And the public official also needs a comment probably, and that is when someone is behind the podium speaking and it's an elected person that's either an R or D, doesn't matter what party they're from, you've automatically politicized the argument and the discussion.
Right.
So, leave Fauci there. You don't need elected officials.
I would say Fauci felt pretty politicized by the end there, too. Personally, he felt that way.
Yeah.
That's what he said.
And we have a difficulty in science, I think, sometimes in expressing ourselves in a clear way. One of the things that biomedical science, physical science is noted for is the scientific method. Everyone's, steeped in that. And one of the things, as Jordan pointed out the other day, is, trying to prove the negative, if you can prove that this is false. So anytime someone is speaking in front of a group of scientists or biomedical people, everyone in the audience is thinking, now, why is this wrong? And it creates sort of a tedious, sometimes, interaction. But the tedium is then carried over to the general conversations that we embedded in science can have. So like last night, I was talking to someone, they said something to me, and I said, well, yeah, but what is that risk adjusted? We go into these areas that no one really understands in the general population.
Mm-hmm. Right. All right. Let's move to you, Gol. You've been researching the impact of psychedelics as a potential master key for many therapeutics, but the field is controversial. Is that fair to say?
Sure.
Yes. And it's had recently, in the last year, a sort of a really direct, encounter with mis and disinformation, with a comprehension of the science, and with groups of people who have decided that it's really important to tear down the work that many of you are doing. Can you tell us about that controversy and sort of educate us as to what the lessons from the last year or two have been?
Sure. Just before I dive into the details of the FDA decision, I have to say I'm deeply allergic to this misinformation, disinformation structure because
Thanks for coming on the panel anyway.
because I wanted to talk about it. I really feel like it's this notion that we are balancing as a group, trying to communicate science in a way that's going to be easy and appealing for people to understand, with saying things with too much certainty that don't convey our true understanding of how much we are likely to be wrong about things like the vaccines and the masks and everything. That's the seedling for distrust. And I would like to just read a passage from a book that was very popular when I was in graduate school. It's a philosophical treatise on bullshit. I'm sure a lot of people have this book. It was came out in 2005. I was a graduate student. I just want to read two quick passages from it. Bullshit is unavoidable whenever circumstances require someone to talk without knowing what he is talking about. Thus, the production of bullshit is stimulated whenever a person's obligations or opportunities to speak about some topic exceed his knowledge of the facts that are relevant to that topic. And I have to say, in neuroscience in particular, there is a ton of neuro bullshit. There is just so much out there. How many people here have heard that psychedelics induce plasticity? Yeah, okay. How many people have heard that we are in a fentanyl faceplant right now, right? Or know that we are in a fentanyl faceplant? How many people also know that the hallmark of all addictive drugs is that they induce incredibly robust plasticity, right? So when we start trying to sell our ideas about these mechanisms around how these drugs are working, and we use imprecise terminology because it's marketable, because we can use a tiny little bit of information to sell, we're going to pair this, technology and this wearable with this magic drug, and we're going to get magical cures, and you sell it as a marketing campaign. This is the kind of bullshit that undermines our credibility in the space. So now going specifically to the FDA decision. So part of the problem with the FDA decision is that we are in the middle of a fentanyl faceplant, and the FDA is feeling very conservative about approving something that they don't really understand how it's working. So they see these remarkable data from Lykos, which did these clinical trials, 2 phase 3 clinical trials. They look at these results and they say, oh my goodness, this company is claiming that these drugs work twice as well as existing drugs using a new method that involves pairing the drug with a therapy. And they're saying the therapy is important, but every single drug in this space, SSRIs, are all sort of sans therapy. They're just the biochemical imbalance model. So this is something new, but we don't understand it. And then you get some people who have their own motivations, whatever those may be, to challenge the veracity of these results, and they get nervous and they start to believe these things, even though they are supposed to make their decisions based on the data available.
Right.
Now, I think that part of the work that we have left to do in this space is to educate members of the scientific community about the mechanism. And I do think that having a sturdy mechanisms to explain why you need the therapy, why you need the psychedelic effect, why you can't make a million new molecules that are going to engineer out the psychedelics out of psychedelics, these are all important things. But I also think that we need to educate ourselves about how we communicate with less bullshit, so that people don't get confused that the plasticity that we're talking about, metaplasticity in this case, related to psychedelics, is different than the hyperplasticity that's associated with addictive drugs. And we just have to figure out a way to admit that we don't know, that we're learning, that there's that understanding how these drugs work is nuanced, and just like we educated people in cancer that not all growth is good growth, right? So we need to educate people that not all plasticity is good plasticity, and I think it's doable.
So I have a question for all three of you then, because it seems like at the core here, it is the question of how. Like how, what lessons, in particular, maybe we can start with you, Lynn, because like, how do you communicate? I mean, we're talking about nuances that are based on, years of study to get to the point of being able to live with these kinds of contradictions and nuances and work in the context of such contradictions and nuances, right? To get to the point of being a doctor or a PhD, right? So how do you communicate that to the public and bring them along so that they're willing to trust you in uncharted waters like those you just described?
Yeah, so I would say that you've got to go from public to a particular stakeholder. You have to get your potential recipients of that benefit to be along on that sort of scientific journey, because otherwise our media outlets, and as much as the scientists may not have refereed the application correctly, the reporters were much more motivated by getting a headline that would get readers. And so find something salacious, find something different, when in fact there's a huge community and relevant authoritative stakeholders who are waiting for new solutions. And you need to bring them along in the development of the science so that they too can be champions, because we've seen, one of the places where I have seen promise is that when you have patient communities that are inserting themselves in that FDA conversation, you might be able to get some more persuasion. But it's really about not waiting until that approval of the market. You need to be bringing a community along to understand what your intent is, what that longer term is, because if you're just going to rely on the public, you have 3 seconds to tell that whole story. And I don't think any of us can talk that fast.
I'll give a really pathetic example of the way I approached it. And I went to my chat GPT and I typed in, how do normal people explain things?
Normal was an important adjective there.
And I got, use simple language, relatable examples, analogies and metaphors, step-by-step explanations. I mean, it was actually really quite good. I find Chat GPT that gives me really great advice.
I guess I'm gonna just take again analogy from what's happened with the FDA ruling. Right after the AdCom met, I sat through the whole thing. I had several friends from various walks of life immediately text me and say, well, it's clear that the FDA is bought out by Big Pharma. This is something that is an existential threat to their business model, and that's why the FDA did not approve it. And a lot of really smart people I know believe this narrative. And so I think one of the things that we have to do is restore our credibility.
Do you not believe that that's true? I just want to be clear.
I mean, I think part of that is truth. There is truth to that statement, insofar as soon as psychedelics started to show efficacy, something like, I don't know, Barry, you can correct me, but I think it was 150 new companies started that were all going to democratize psychedelics by monetizing novel compounds. They were going to pair them with a wearable and this technology and that bullshit technology.
In other words, psychedelics were just going to run the trace routes of pharma.
Yeah, and there were so many companies that raised an incredible amount of money on very scant data using the existing sort of biochemical imbalance model of neuropsychiatric disease, and they were essentially threatening to overwhelm the psychedelic space. And then you have a company like Lykos, who did most of their clinical trials still as a nonprofit, and at the very end became a public company. I think the trust in that kind of not-for-profit model is higher than the trust in pharmaceutical companies, right? Because the profit motive has again and again, and we're in the middle of the fentanyl faceplant. We cannot forget that is undermining the credibility of pharmaceutical companies to be the thought leaders in this space. And we have to address that. And it's not just a matter of coming up with better lingo and more clear communications and getting people involved early. We have to fix the trust problem because we have violated their trust as a community. The patients, the stakeholders, they are violated. They're not imagining that.
Right. I want to open it up to the audience. And can we get I'm usually or maybe Jordan, you can be our mic runner here. I'm not sure how much time we have. Can you reset the time and let me know? Okay, great, perfect. We have enough time for a good conversation here, so let's get started.
Great panel. I want to echo and maybe get people to opine on this, as I think that part of the problem is, as you say, there's uncertainty. And this is what you know at the moment, and we're going to continue to update it. And we may change tomorrow based on more data. I think that was completely lost in the pandemic, and that's the big problem. And I would also say the other context about the FDA is the FDA got hugely blamed, Janet Woodcock in particular, when she really had nothing to do with it, for the opioid crisis. The opioid crisis was generated by the slimy people post-approval. And the whole idea is that they got, and that's the reason she didn't become the full-time commissioner.
Right.
I mean, really, for no good reason, because you got blamed for the opioid crisis and got blamed for approving a short-term fentanyl product for medical procedures, not for the street.
Yeah.
But this is what, but the FDA is conservative and they are afraid of getting slammed in this way. And there's so much bad press that way. And, the people at the top are actually pretty good.
Yeah. And I just want to amplify exactly that point by saying one other thing. So right now in psychedelics, there are companies who are very excited about the fact that, well, the FDA is conservative, it's annoying, this is this bureaucratic mess that we have to get around. Let's just downplay the importance of therapy. So that this is what the companies are trying to do. They're saying, let's downplay the importance of therapy so that we can get these approved as quickly as possible. And I think that is incredibly dangerous because it is a lie that the companies are telling to the public that we don't need to pair these. And, this is why the mechanism matters so much, right? Because our studies are showing that what the efficacy of that rather than being just a next generation SSRI that's, undoing the biochemical imbalance of serotonin, what these drugs are actually doing is enabling learning. And that if you give these drugs and you don't give the right context, you give a bad learning context, like Charles Manson, then they can do very bad things. But if you give the right learning context, so if they have PTSD, they're going to get therapy. We are working on pairing the psychedelic with motor learning for stroke rehabilitation. So the context really matters. But all of these drug companies who are trying to get there faster and sidestep the FDA, they are setting us up for another fentanyl faceplant. And all of the chemical companies who are saying, oh, we can engineer a new psychedelic that we can patent by getting rid of the psychedelic side effects and make these drugs that are, hyperplastogenic or psychoplastogenic is what they're saying, right? These companies are essentially taking Ibogaine, which is right now our best chance of addressing the heroin addiction crisis, and turning it into a new addictive drug, right? So these are the trust problems when we let business motivations sidestep the meager regulatory processes that we have in place. And as a solution, what should the government do? They should better fund the FDA to make sure that they have enough money to hire enough regulators and enough well-qualified, well-educated scientists to be on these advisory panels and restore the public's trust that they are going to safeguard against these abuses of, I'm sorry to say, business interests that don't care about the patients.
So I do want to build on it because we know from the cancer community the lengths to which the FDA understood the patient urgency. So we looked at accelerated approvals in different models. Do we not care enough? Well, I know not enough, but some. Do we not care enough about mental illness? Do we not care enough about PTSD? Do we not think that suicide is a mortality crisis that we should be solving?
Well, one way of doing that
Right.
is to have, trusted forums with the FDA as just putting the investment in education,
Right.
getting groups together.
We have a question over here.
Hello, everybody. First of all, some context. My name is Steve Ellis. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Paramount Advertising. So I'm an unusual member here, perhaps. I want to thank Jordan and John for inviting me because this has been a truly learning experience. So thank you very much. Very simple and fundamental question. You guys are all doing incredible work over the last day or so. I've seen some incredibly innovative but very complex innovation that needs to be communicated. You've laid out the problems of trust, they're very real. The problems of communication, very real. I'd love everyone here to think, because this is a problem you're all going to face if you're an investor, if you're a company, if you're a scientist, if you're a doctor. What is the right format for communicating accurately with a scaled audience? Because that's a problem you're going to have to solve. You need to reach 1 billion people. You need to give them a message that's nuanced and complicated. What format would you do that in the modern world that you think could be successful? I'm not sure there's an answer, by the way, but that's the sort of thing that I have to think about when I'm thinking about helping pharma companies reach large audiences. I think it's a problem that's going to have to be solved by people in this room, perhaps with my help, I hope, but something I'd like to see. Maybe Lynn, you probably have a view on that. Thank you.
The problem is the attention span, right? And so what we have to be able to do is figure out how you create a tragically complicated funnel to get the people who have a node of interest to be able to swim down further into the deeper content. And when I speak about getting stakeholders involved, it's about having that chorus of informed patients and clinicians together to really rally, because you're forcing a step change in philosophy where it is creating, because again, right, it's risk, benefit, and safety. You better make that risk a little bit different, because that's another way to frame where the potential benefit is. Because without this, and I think the risk, not only excluding the FDA, is you've got a black market that'll run wild and people will get harmed and not really benefit.
I think we also have to be aware of our own apertures that tend to be narrow. During the pandemic, we took as an organization, as CDC and others did, this language of follow the science, follow the science. And after the introduction of the vaccine, so in probably the second quarter of 2021, I was sitting outside having a glass of wine with a good friend who was chair of political science at the University of Chicago, and he said, I laid out what we were doing. He said, are you intending to insult me? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, you say follow the science, but you're completely ignoring the social science. And I said, well, tell me more about that. And he said, well, once the transmission is lessened and there was an introduction of the vaccine, there is a really good science behind the separation of children from other groups of children and their education in the classroom. So we were saying, follow the science, and we were looking at things through our own aperture that wasn't wide enough.
In other words, there's very good social science that you possibly could be following your own advice, follow the science. The social science says that there is harm being done to children who are not being reintegrated into schools as soon as possible.
That's right. And then I made a mistake of insulting my friend by saying, well, listen, Rod, we're thinking of the certainty of sciences. We have physical sciences, biological sciences, and social sciences. And that didn't go over very well.
Well, there's neuroscience evidence for that as well,
Yeah.
right? The social brain and the amazing amount of harm, but because of this narrative of, trust the science, as a neuroscience department, many of us were saying, we're going to cause a major mental health care crisis by keeping people socially isolated beyond this 2 weeks. In mice, when you socially isolate mice for 2 weeks, you induce schizophrenia. Like, this is a big deal, and yet we felt like we were not allowed to talk about it because we were going to be stigmatized as, Trump supporters or something for having a different opinion than Fauci, which he's just one of the heads of NIH, right? So
It's a really interesting example. Jamie.
So the title of the panel is misinformation. And I'm going to be a little challenging for a second, because I think what we're talking about is not information, which is the raw data on which anyone can draw an opinion or an understanding. What we're talking about is, why aren't the people listening to our opinions about the science? So you're not asking people to look at the data. You're saying, I have an opinion, you should believe me because I'm trustworthy. And then the second thing I hear you confounding, and this is the part that I built a house during the pandemic, and I work with all my construction workers, and they came to trust me as someone that would discuss science with them. And they gave me all these questions. And their concern was not understanding. They're very smart people. Their concern was that someone was going to tell them what to do. And so you're also confounding who is a gatekeeper and authority. And I got to be blunt. There is an assumption in this industry, like, let's say I wanted to go buy a car, and I wanted to buy a car that was not particularly a good design and not particularly efficient and more money than I cost. We act like you need a prescription to do that. And so the condescension of the people that are capable of interpreting the information by demanding that we pay attention to their opinion while we tell them what to do without offering the information is the problem. And I'm sorry, the conversation about this is really about the agency of human beings, where medicine is really, if I tried to put the FDA's behavior about human agency, which is the greatest creator of health, through, the FDA would never get approved by itself. It's a disaster. So the whole thing is about denial of agency, selecting who gets to have an opinion, and not actually providing the information. And so,
I think that's a really good point. And it's almost conveying my agency trumps yours based on a field that I happen to be in, rather than having a normal conversation as the ChatGPT would lay out.
it's just exactly why I don't like the terminology, because I have this intuition that it's being used to censor other people's opinions. And I'm deeply allergic to censorship as a scientist, because the way that we figure stuff out is by putting out an idea, being challenged, being wrong, and that iterative process is the process of science. It is not a scale of truthiness. That's just not a thing. And I mean, it's not real, right? And so I'm nervous about framing it in this way, because I do think it's going to do more damage to our ability to engage and have those conversations.
Well, and I'll say, Jamie, to your point, in our data last year, we found that 48% of adults in the U.S. aged 18 to 34 believe that doing their own research online can make them as smart as doctors on issues. And what we heard from Vinod yesterday is that in 2 years, all expertise will be free. So we're going to have to...
Freely circulated is, I think, the really important modifier there.
Well,
Not
taking your
free.
chat GPT plus the self-discovery, we've got a whole new framework for authority and credential, and that's going to lead to an unsettled landscape.
Without question. Is it over here? Okay, great.
Jack Gallant. This is a great conversation.
Another UC Berkeley person.
Another UC
I know
Berkeley
Jack.
person.
I know that Jack's from Berkeley.
This is a great conversation, and certainly there's a lot of blame and responsibility for this crisis of misinformation, and both the corporate overlords and the government. But I also want to point out that from the point of view of science, the problem is us. Science is full of misinformation itself, because frankly, the standards for publication are way lower than you think. Science is just a bunch of people trying to do a job, and like any group of humans, they gamify the job and they try to drive down the criterion to make their job as easy as possible. And that means essentially that most scientific publications are based on point null hypothesis testing, and that's basically a statistical framework that's essentially comparing your effect to completely random noise. So 99% of publications out there are basically saying, I have a thing here that's not completely random crap. But that doesn't mean it's big or interesting or useful or anything, and none of those kinds of criteria are required in any publication, in any journal that I know of. So what this means is that to publish, that basically there's a lot of papers published in science journals that are type 1 errors. They're claims about an effect that's not a real effect. And the whole field is rife with type 1 errors. There are papers published in Science and Nature every week that look like promising drug molecules, and the first thing any pharma company does is they have to replicate the entire trial, the entire study, to see if it's a real effect. It's a real crisis. And if scientists took more responsibility for their own work and raised their own standards so that they're only publishing things that are both real effects and interesting, valuable things, then the number of science articles, scientific publications would go way down, and it would be easier to identify the signal in the noise. So I think that's part of the problem is, the newspapers and magazines pick up on a lot of journal articles that are just kind of misinformation inherently from the original study.
Or maybe to use Gull's term, bullshit. we have time for one more, Jordan. I'll let you pick. Marty in the front has a question.
Oh, Marty gets the microphone then.
Marty gets last word.
Well, I think you assigned me a job
Another
of having
Berkeley
a question.
person, by the way. I love this.
And I think actually you assigned me a job of asking a question. So,
State who you are.
I'm Marty Hurst, a professor of computer science at UC Berkeley, and I was asked to have a question about misinformation. And so I'm a bit of an outsider to this crowd, and I will say that you have all been commendable at beating yourselves up for not doing things right. But when I take the word misinformation, I think of that as intentionally wrong information. And so why don't we take ourselves off the blame train here for a moment and ask, so why is there a lot of people claiming to solve problems in medicine that actually are deliberate shams? And why do those work? And we heard the stem cell example earlier yesterday. I think a lot of this comes from the fact that people want a solution for their medical problems, and often there isn't one. So there's a vacuum formed. So my question is, what can the medical establishment do when there isn't a solution for a problem people have to stop the vacuum from being filled by people who are truly trying to pull the wool over people's eyes?
Well, I never went to Berkeley, but I know people who have. Your question, if I understand it correctly, is we have these voids and gaps that get filled with misinformation in the absence of certainty. And we tend not to do a lot about that, I think, as a field. Others may feel differently, but I think we leave those gaps open.
There was a really interesting question yesterday related to this, which is what I forget which group was asked by the audience. What are the things you don't know that you want to know, but they're so hard you haven't worked on them? I think it would be really interesting to publish that on a regular basis, and sort of make it a thing. Call it like content marketing, if you will. But like that would be a really interesting thing to know. Like in every given field, what are the things that we don't know? And I think that would establish some trust to see leading scientists acknowledging that they don't know. And I think it relates to your point at the beginning about, what we didn't do right, which is to say, look, there's a lot we don't know, but this is what we do know. At this moment, we know this. It could change, right? So maybe, not the blame train, but a little more humility.
Well, and I will use the model that the Johns Hopkins, because we haven't talked about Johns Hopkins here yet. Johns Hopkins. Well, so inspired by
He was at Hopkins for a very long time. I think she's still associated with.
So
yes.
Inspired by the work that Caitlin Rivers has done in epidemiology in her book, we have a model every day that we turn to that presents us with uncertain information with scientific foundation, and it's the weather. And so somehow we've been able to include in our lives daily something that has some nuance, that isn't always 100% predictable, but helps us prepare in our lives day in and day out. And so maybe there is a way in which we can find a way to communicate those situations of transition and those areas around which we should have some confidence versus more confidence, again, anchored in the science. And I just thought that was sort of an eloquent little
It's
idea.
a lovely way to end because we're running a couple minutes over, and we unfortunately can't run over today because we have to clear out at a certain time. That weather metaphor is great because this has been some good damn weather, and I'm not talking about outside, like inside. This is good weather. But we also had to prepare in case it rained all 3 days, which is why that tent has sides to it. I'm glad we didn't need them, but you've got to prepare. And yeah.
Real quick, I just want to say that this conversation is going to continue amongst this group. We are going to create a working group amongst people who want to be part of the how do we create effective communication around science and medicine. I mean, it says truth and medicine right there. And my slide yesterday would show true, and truth. Like these are all things we're just trying to get to accurate. I'll just leave and end this with a comment of my own, which is what is trust? How do we define trust? And there are sociologists and social scientists who have written about this, books about it. I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. And my definition of trust is the ability to make someone feel valued, the ability to make someone feel included, these are different things, and the ability to let somebody feel vulnerable in the participation of the former two. And so until you create an environment where someone is included, like you were saying, and you have to bring them along, but they're valued, not just included, but actually heard, and then everyone has a sense to feel like maybe they can have some humility and be wrong, and it's okay.
Yeah.
This goes back to it's better to be right than get it right. Better to get it right than be right. So anyway, there's a lot of other comments and conversations that I know want to happen, need to happen, will happen.
We will
and this is the beginning. So for those of you who are wanted to raise your hand that didn't get a question, we will be creating a working group after this to really move this forward.
Yeah.
And we won't be publishing white papers. We'll be publishing some other thing.
Gray papers? I don't know.
Well, they may not be papers. Maybe
They may not be papers.
Maybe they'll be.
But please join me in
Transformers.
thanking this extraordinary group.
Yeah.
Thank you, then.